Good afternoon. Welcome to RTI's Advanced Control University. My name is Clint Forberg, Director of Training for RTI. I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today's class is a webinar on the new RTiPanel, an application to allow you to use, at this time, iOS devices like an iPhone, an iPad, an iPod Touch to control your RTI system. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about it. We'll talk a bit about the theory, we'll talk about the product itself, and we'll also get into some configuration applications, talking about the app itself. We'll spend some time talking about licensing options for the RTiPanel and spend some time showing the unique programming features used with the RTiPanel. As always, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A panel in the GoToWebinar software, and I'll do my very best to answer those questions as we go through. And this class is also being recorded for later posting on the RTI website for further review. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to have several PowerPoint slides. We'll get into some programming using Integration Designer, and then we'll finish off in the PowerPoint as well. All right, so what is the RTiPanel? And this is something we've been working on for a long time. Like it or not, love it or not, customers want to use their iOS devices like their iPad or their iPhone to control their audio, video, lighting, security, all the various electronic subsystems that we're installing for our clients in these projects. So we've spent great lengths and programmed all this and developed this application in-house. And it's unanimously been awarded awards all over the industry, including CEDIA's Best New Product Award at CEDIA this year. So some things that make the RTiPanel unique versus some other applications that are out there from other control companies. Number one, and first and foremost, is the fact that you, as the integrator, have the ability to program the RTiPanel to not only function the way you want, but to look the way that you want. This isn't a pre-built template like many free apps that you download from several companies would be, but it's a completely configurable application that you can make act, look, sound, respond precisely the way that you need to for your client system. So if you designed a touch panel in their home, a handheld, or an in-wall controller, you could easily configure the RTiPanel to match that user interface, giving them the same interface from their iOS devices as they're accustomed to from their dedicated controllers in the project. The RTiPanel allows us to use these iOS or Apple devices remotely if necessary. As long as they have an internet connection, the ability to connect via 3G or Wi-Fi, we have the ability to control our RTI-controlled system from anywhere in the world. Works on LAN, works on WAN, works on 3G, and it has the ability to auto-discover and auto-detect where it is seamlessly to your customer. So there's no switching back and forth. If they're in the house on the local Wi-Fi, it's going to communicate over the LAN. It's going to auto-discover that processor that's in there. Once they get into the car, it's going to disconnect from the WAN and set up for 3G if the device is so enabled. They get to Starbucks, log into the Wi-Fi there, then they can control it over the wide area network. So it makes it a seamless interface for your customer for, again, adjusting their thermostat, arming their security systems, controlling their lights, their audio, their video, whatever it happens to be. And again, most importantly, the interface is completely customizable using Integration Designer. Now, there's a lot of iOS applications out there for a lot of different devices, and in many cases they're free from the App Store, so you can download a DirecTV application, for example, or a TiVo application, and those are all great. However, if we're going to control our audio-video system using this iOS device, having 14 or 15 different apps on the Apple device is a lot like having 13 or 14 remotes on the coffee table. It's not necessarily user-friendly. Open up this app to turn on my TV, open up this one to run DirecTV, open up this one to run my Yamaha AV receiver. They all do what they're supposed to do, but again, they don't give us that seamless, automated process that we're looking for our customer. We want to make this easily used, intuitive. And another advantage the RTiPanel gives you is the ability to control devices that aren't necessarily networkable. If you need to send IR commands to a DirecTV receiver, for example, you can still use this on non-networkable devices because we're talking to our processor. We're not talking directly to the devices that are within our system. So it truly gives you an option for controlling these devices from anywhere in the world if necessary. At this point, the RTiPanel is available for use on the iPhone 3, the iPhone 4 and 4S. They have the same screen resolution. Works on the iPod Touch, and it also works on the iPad and the iPad 2. There are plans to have Android support coming in first quarter of 2012, so stay tuned for that, please. The RTiPanel application is compatible with any RTI XP series processor, so that's going to be the XP3, the XP6, and the XP8. You're going to want to make sure that you update the firmware in these devices to the most currently available version that's on the RTI dealer website. Just a note on the hardware capabilities of these devices, if you're using an XP8 with your RTiPanel, we strongly encourage you, if not require you, there's an SD card slot on the front of the XP-based processor please put a 2 gig SD card in there. You're going to want to make sure that it's a 2 gig or smaller card. This allows it to support the additional memory needs that the RTiPanel puts on it. The way that it works is instead of excuse me, downloading the program directly into the Apple device, which obviously we can't do via Integration Designer, when we create the RTiPanel program or system file within Integration Designer, we upload to our central control processor. When the device, the iOS device, connects with that XP series processor, the processor actually pushes that graphic user interface, that GUI information, over Wi-Fi, over 3G, out to the device where it becomes resident. So it's important that the processor has enough memory to support these pages of graphics that are on there. Now, the XP3 and the XP6 give you the ability to support somewhere around 10 to 15 RTiPanel applications, many. However, the XP8 simply does not have enough internal memory, which is why there's that SD card slot on there. So stick a 2 gig SD card, make sure it's an SD card, standard density, plug it in there, and you'll have enough to support a virtually unlimited number of RTiPanel applications on your XP8. So good information. Please be sure you keep that in mind. A very valuable resource for any integrator that has intentions of programming the RTiPanel application is the RTiPanel Setup Guide. This is available from the dealer section of the RTI website, and I'd strongly encourage you to download this. It's about a 10-page document that tells you everything you need to know regarding overview, regarding configuration, regarding PC access, regarding remote access. All the network requirements, all the special programming features are available in this document. So again, it's available at www.rticorp.com in the dealer section. If you don't have a username and dealer account, be sure you contact your local RTI distributor to get set up as an RTI dealer and obtain this document. It's going to be a valuable resource for you. Today's class is going to run around an hour, and there's a number of things that I want to condense in here. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to post them. I'll do my very best to answer them as we go along. First, I want to talk a little about the application itself, RTiPanel. There's several components when we want to use this iOS device to control our audio, video, lighting, security, HVAC, things like that. So the first step is going to be to take the iOS device that we're going to use to control this system, whether it's my customer's iPhone, an iPad, whatever it happens to be. But from this device that we intend to use to control the system, we're going to log into the Apple App Store. Once we get in there, we're going to search for RTiPanel, as you see right here. Here's the icon. In this case, you can see that the screenshot shows that it's installed. We're going to click on it, and we're going to go ahead and install that. The application itself is free. There's no charge for this application because in most cases, you're going to be using the customer's equipment to log into it. So it's very difficult for us to charge whatever price is for an application because it takes you out of the profit equation. We want to make sure that the profit for this goes to you. So the app itself is free, and what the app essentially gives us is a shell that loads onto that iOS device that allows us to push our information onto it. So have your customer install the application. It is a free application, and once they have it up and ready on their desktop or on their screen, they're ready to start using the RTiPanel. As you can see, it creates an icon on the home page or wherever they'd like to put it. In this case, it's labeled RTiPanel. This will show up on the iOS device itself. So the application available from the App Store, it's called the RTiPanel. It is free, and you're going to have your customer download that and install it onto the iOS device that we're going to use to control our system. When you download the RTiPanel application, your customer clicks on that button. Prior to configuring the system, they're going to get a screen that looks similar to this with two buttons on there. It's a Welcome to RTiPanel screen. Two buttons, Get Started and Demo Mode. Get Started is not going to do anything if there's not a processor already configured in the system file, but if you or your client hits Demo Mode, and this is a great tool that you can use for demonstrating the capabilities to your customers without having the requirement of being connected to a processor, so you can fully demonstrate the way it looks, functions, feels, and acts. Go ahead and hit Demo Mode, and this is going to open up an emulation of a control system, a demonstration where I can click on buttons, I can swipe screens, I can pull through scrolling lists. It allows you to demonstrate the capabilities of the device without having to actually sell them a license, without actually having to connect to a processor. So Demo Mode is a handy tool for selling this to a client. As I mentioned, the RTiPanel app itself is free. However, the downside to using an iOS device to control our system, it truly is long. I'm not a huge fan, especially of using this Apple device as the primary or only controller in a system. And there's a variety of reasons for that. The iPad ends up in the kids' room, makes it difficult to run the home theater. There are several things that limit its capability, but first and foremost is profitability. If your customer is using an iPad to control their system or control a zone of their system, it means that you're not selling an in-wall or handheld control in that zone, so it can affect the profitability of your business. We want to make sure that this is something that you can get paid for, that you can get and make money on. Every Apple or iOS device used to control or access the system must be licensed. Every device has to have its own license. So if mom and dad each have an iPhone, each of those devices need a license. If there's an iPad in the system, it needs a license. So every Apple device requires a license in order to communicate with it. The license is available in a couple of different places. Number one, you can purchase it from your local RTI distributor. Contact the distributor. They can give you all the information you need to get you set up with it. Alternatively, you can also purchase RTiPanel licenses directly from the RTI dealer website. When you log into the dealer website on the left-hand side, you'll see a column, and in there you'll find a section for app licenses for the RTiPanel. Again, please remember, every Apple device must have its own individual license. So purchase them from your distributor or purchase them from RTiCorp.com. If you're going to be purchasing the license from RTiCorp.com, you're going to follow the prompts that are on the screen. There are two licensing types available. There is the iPad license and the iPhone license at $149 dealer and $99 dealer respectively. Rather than charging for the application, having your customer pay for it, by giving you a dealer cost on this allows you to mark it up to make some profit on this. Charge for your programming just as you would charge for any device that's out there. So it gives you an opportunity to make some money on these projects. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose the type of license necessary for each of the iOS devices. Good question in the chat window. It says, is there a limit how many licenses can be used on one XP processor? Realistically, no, depending on the processor. Theoretically, you might run into some applications. If you're running an XP3 or an XP6, again, it'll support up to somewhere between 10 and 15 RTI panels, depending on how many graphics and how many pages are on there. However, if you're using an XP8 and you put that 2 gig card in there, it's going to be far more than the system itself could support, so no worries with that. So depending on how many RTI panels you need, keep in mind what's in there. Here's another good question. Are the licenses transferable? Now, the licenses themselves are addressed or assigned to the MAC address of the primary processor in the system. However, they are transferable between Apple devices. So, for example, my customer switches from an iPhone 3 to an iPhone 4S, or they switch from their iPad to their iPad 2. The licenses themselves are tied to our processor by MAC address. They're not necessarily tied to that Apple device itself, not permanently anyway. So if my customer breaks his phone and gets a new phone, all I need to do is re-download to my processors, reset it. So I can power cycle it, I can hit the reset button on the front, and by doing that, it essentially releases the application from the Apple devices. I'm going to install the RTiPanel app on the new phone or the iPad, download, and it's ready to go. All right, so two types of licenses available. The iPhone license works on the iPhone 3, the iPhone 4, the iPhone 4S. The iPad license works on those and the iPad and the iPad 2 as well. So the iPad license will actually work on any iOS device. However, the iPhone license only on the iPhone or iPod products. So again, keep that in mind when you're purchasing your license. Be sure to get the proper one. Once you get that license code, whether you get it from your distributor or you get it from the RTI dealer website, the next thing you need to do is generate the licensed file. This is what gets installed into Integration Designer's system file. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that code or that information that we got from them, and we're going to click on Generate License. Now, it's important you have the MAC address of the processor that it's going to be assigned to before you get your license here. So a couple of ways you can do that. Sometimes on the box or on the label of the processor itself, it'll show you the MAC address. But a foolproof method for that is to download it to an Integration Designer, and in the download screen, you'll see the MAC address listed right there. So you copy down those numbers, and it's going to prompt you to enter that information before you generate that license. This is the form on the website that shows you where that's done. So you're going to put in the license code. This is what you're going to get from RTI, or you're going to get from your local RTI distributor. You're going to enter in the MAC address of the central control processor, the primary gateway processor. If you have multiple processors, you're going to choose one of these XP processors as the gateway, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later. You're going to enter in the MAC address twice to make sure we get the proper one, put in your email, and then some spam bot type security protection in there, and you're going to go ahead and click on Get License. Now here's a good question. What if my XP processor is defective? What if it gets replaced? If you have that scenario, call tech support or call customer service, and I'm sure they have a way to work with you. I'm not exactly certain what that process is, but you can contact your RTI distributor. They should be able to walk you through it, or you can call tech support or customer service, and they can outline that process for you. So I'm certain we'll be able to take care of you if that happens. All right, once we've entered that information, we're simply going to complete the checkout process. You're going to put in your email address, you're going to create an account, you're going to create a password, your billing information, your credit card information, all that's going to be entered in there. And once that's completed and sent in, we're going to send you that RTiPanel license. It's going to come to you as a file, and you can rename that file as necessary. So it's going to be labeled by the MAC address of the processor that you entered, but you can make it into a more user-friendly name if you'd like. For example, this one's called the XP3 license, so it could be the Jones family license or whatever you wanted to call it. But again, it's a renamable file, and we can just throw it in a folder on our desktop or wherever we'd like to keep it. So that's the process. We get the app, we load it onto the iOS device, and we obtain a license for each Apple device used in our system. Let's talk a little bit about network requirements. There's some specific requirements if we want to use something other than a native dedicated controller to have reliable control of our systems here. Now, one of the things that makes the RTiPanel so powerful, in addition to its customizability, its configurability, is its extremely low latency. One thing I've noticed with a lot of iOS applications for various control interfaces for various products that are out there, latency is truly an issue. So latency means by the time I open up that app until it connects, starts controlling, starts giving me feedback, can be anywhere between 5 and up to 30 seconds. Now that really defeats the use of this to control our system. And if you want to use it, just hit mute or something, it's not going to work out very well. The RTiPanel was designed from the ground up to be as low latency as we could possibly make it. So we want to make sure when it's on Wi-Fi, when it's on LAN or WAN, connection time on the RTiPanel is typically in a properly configured system somewhere around 2 to 3 seconds. It's incredibly fast how quickly it connects and starts controlling. If you're on 3G, it's obviously predicated on the quality of your signal, but again, it's very quick. Generally somewhere 4, 5, 6 seconds, even on a marginal signal, you're going to have full reliable control using the RTiPanel. So one of the keys to making this as low latency as possible is, number one, each of them having their individual license. That's an important part of the process. But secondly, making sure that we have a properly configured network. Here's another good question. Can one iOS device talk to multiple processors? For example, a Vacation Home 2, LA office, New York office. Great question. And it absolutely can, but it's going to require some configuration. We're going to spend some time talking about that, how to get that device to talk to different processors in different homes. My customer has 2 homes. They want to be able to use their iPhone for this house, use it for that house. And I'll spend some time showing you exactly how that's done. Great question. Okay. Network requirements. What needs to be involved in the network for using the RTiPanel? Number one, first and foremost, your local Apple devices, your iOS devices, must be on the same Ethernet network as the XP processor. So the XP processor plugs into the local switch, goes to my Wi-Fi router, and if I'm using it locally, the iOS device has to be connected to the same network. That's how it's going to communicate over the Ethernet network. If you want to use something remotely, meaning off-site, outside of that project, if I want to be able to control my home from my office, for example, I need to make sure that it has an active internet connection, meaning not only an Ethernet connection, but it has to be able to go online via Wi-Fi, via 3G, but it has to be able to go online and connect to that device. So that's a very important thing to consider. The processor and the iOS device must be on the same network if it's to be used locally. If it's going to be used remotely, must have internet access. Now let's talk a little about remote access. And this is one of the things that this makes this a very, very powerful application. The ability to log into my house from my office and arm my security system, for example. Turn on lights if I know somebody's coming over. Change my thermostat, whatever it happens to be. The ability to access the system remotely is really a great application of this application, no pun intended. So what do we need to do to get remote access? Now, to set up for remote access, you're going to have a bit of network savvy, and I'm no network expert by any means, but the technical document on configuring the RTiPanel has lots of good information. There's a second technical document on configuring the RTI virtual panel, which has a lot of good information for you if you're a networking novice that'll get you up and running very quickly. But again, number one, your processor must have a static IP address on the network, and it has to have a static IP address from the ISP, one that's never going to change. If that's not possible, if you can't contact Comcast or whatever and get a static ISP provided static IP address for that device, the second option is creating a dynamic domain name server account, a dynamic DNS account, which works great. There's many free applications out there, and they work just fine. So what you can do is you can just go to dynedns.com, dyne.com, and create a dynamic DNS account for your customer. Then you need to go into your client's router, and every router is different, so I just have a basic screenshot here, but it depends on the type that you're using. You're going to have some familiarity with your client's networking equipment, but you need to provide that DNS information to the router that's in the device. You'll also need to configure port forwarding to your gateway processor. If you have multiple processors in there, one of them must be designated as the gateway. So we need to configure it to port 4110 to open that up so it can communicate with that device. So port forwarding is important, and either a static ISP provided address or a dynamic DNS address. And I'm going to show you later how to enter this DNS hostname into Integration Designer for each system that you require. So remote access requires a static IP address from the provider or a dynamic DNS address. Okay, at this point, let's start talking about programming. So now we understand the application, we understand the licensing process, and the network requirements, remote access configuration. We're comfortable with all that. And again, that's all outlined again for you in that technical document that you can download from rticorp.com. Now, one of the things that makes the RTI panel so incredibly powerful is the fact that it programs just like a native device within Integration Designer. If you can program an RTI remote control in-wall or central control processor, you can easily program the RTI panel application as well. But that being said, there are some unique features in there that can make it very cool, but some might be somewhat unfamiliar to you within Integration Designer. So at this point, we're going to get out of the PowerPoint. Let's get over to Integration Designer. Okay, and we've got a basic system file created, and you can see that I have an XP processor built into this system file. First thing we're going to do is we're going to add our license to our system file. We downloaded it from rticorp.com. I've got my license file. It must be installed into our system file. Now to install that license that we've downloaded, we're going to go into Integration Designer's File tab in the upper left-hand corner. I'm going to click on File, and that's available in System Properties. So I'm presuming everybody watching has a good comprehensive knowledge of using Integration Designer, so we're not going to spend a lot of time going through the nuts and bolts of it. But we're going to go to System Properties. In System Properties, you're going to find a tab labeled iOS/Virtual Panel. This is where that information has to go. Now what it's going to ask us is for remote access information. If we're using this outside of the LAN, outside of the local area network, we need to configure it exactly to do so. So I'm going to designate one of my processors, in this case I only have one, as the external gateway, the XP processor that's going to be used. Now we need to put in that IP address, that static IP address from our ISP, or the dynamic DNS host name, essentially. So we'll just go ahead and type it in, .dynedns, whatever that information is. We're going to type that in there, make sure it's at 4110, and now we need to add our license. So the remote access information, designate a gateway, and put in the DNS address of that device. Now we're going to install the license. So under the license sections, you can see a button that says Add. Simply click on it, and now we're going to navigate through Windows to wherever that license is that we downloaded. So you can see mine opens up a folder that I call RTiPanel Licenses. It's just right on my desktop, and I'm going to find the appropriate license for the processor. And again, they're listed initially by MAC address. I'm going to hit Open, and now you can see that I've installed 2 of the iPad licenses. And remember, the iPad license also works on the iPhone, also works on the iPod Touch. So I've got 2 access licenses that I've installed into my system file. So that's the first step. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and click OK. Now, let's start adding these RTI panels, using these iOS devices to control our system. The way we're going to do this is exactly as if we were adding a remote to our system or an in-wall controller. We're going to go up to Device, Add New, and we're going to open up that Add Device dialog box. We're going to go in, you're going to find a section, in addition to the wireless handheld controllers, in addition to those dedicated hardwired in-wall controllers, a section called Virtual Controls. Here's where you're going to find the RTI panels for an iPhone 3, an iPhone 4 or 4S, or an iPad, and this works on iPad 1 or iPad 2. In this case, I'm going to program an iPhone 3 because that's what I happen to have. I'm going to go ahead and click on it, just as I would with the device. Wants me to name it. And I'll go ahead and name it, click OK. And then just like a typical remote controller in-wall, it has page wizard pages available to it. So you don't have to program this from scratch. You can. Again, you have complete autonomy to program this however you would like. But we also have page wizard pages that are available for you. So I can go in, find the page that I'd like, and hit Insert, just as we would with a typical Integration Designer device. Go ahead and delete this blank page. And there's the pages that have been added on there. Here's a good question. Can you set up the iPad programming before you get the license? Absolutely. You can go ahead and set up your programming, your configuration. You can have everything done right up until the point that you get your license. And this also allows you to do things like merging pages, importing devices, so you can really create those templates just like you can with an RTI remote control. So you can most definitely go ahead and create your configurations prior to downloading them before you have the license. No problem whatsoever. Okay. So now I've added my device. Very simple. Once the device has been added, just like we would with a remote control, we need to go in and talk about the properties of those devices. So let's go to the System Workspace and right-click on that iOS device that we just added. I'm going to right-click, and we're going to choose Properties. Terrific. Now under the General tab, you'll see that there's first option, Supported Orientations. We can choose to lock the RTI panel on our device into a portrait mode only or a landscape mode only. So if I'm holding it upright or I'm tilting it to the side, I can go ahead and lock my device to that. We can also support auto rotation, meaning it can have one view when I'm holding it upright. When I turn it to the side, I can create a second view for it. Now that second view can have all the same buttons if you would like. It can also have completely different buttons. We'll talk a little bit about how to set that up. Specifically with something like an iPhone where you have a very limited amount of screen real estate to work with, supporting auto rotation can be a great idea because it gives you, double the screen real estate to play with. So for example, you can have a watch TV page where you have your cursor functions, guide, channel up, channel down, volume. When you're holding it upright in portrait mode, flip it to landscape, all of a sudden there's my favorite TV channels. Flip it back up and there's my channel information again. So I'll show you how to configure it for the same or for different views based on your auto rotation. Output. In the output, instead of having a standalone mode or a system mode like a remote controller and in-wall does, we simply need to configure the default processor. So we're going to tell that right in there. And there's also a tab for security. You have the ability to put a password on the iOS device. So if you're running a security system, for example, or a thermostat, somebody picks up the phone, I don't want them running my house. So I can go ahead and type in a default password. Check this hide typing box, 1, 2, 3, oops, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now, when the RTI panel application is open, it's going to prompt us for a password prior to connecting and allowing us to control the system. Now, a note on this. If security is important to your client, keep in mind, if the RTI panel application is still running on the device, it's not going to prompt you again for the password. So if you open up a different application and leave RTI panel running, it won't prompt you for that password again. So for maximum security, be sure you close that application every time you download it. That way it'll prompt you for the password and it'll be completely secure. But you have the ability to type a password in there and you're all set. All right, so we've gone through, talked about the properties of that specific device. Now let's take a look at the screen here and you'll see that you have some new drawing tools on the template palette on the bottom left-hand corner of Integration Designer. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Draw button tool, the Select button tool, things like that. And most of you are probably also familiar with the two-way graphics built into Integration Designer, where we have a full selection of toggle buttons, we have a selection of graphs, sliders, all kinds of things that are in there. And for the most part, you're not going to be using those stock graphics built into Integration Designer. So let's flip to one of these pages here, and I'm just going to delete some of these buttons. Bear with me. Okay, so we got some tools in Integration Designer that are specific to the iOS devices. First of these is the Draw button tool. Now again, the bottom left-hand corner, we can click on the pencil, allows me to draw a button on the screen. Now unlike Integration Designer where we have a wide array of shapes that we can use, for example, a rectangular button, rounded corners, an oval button, a shadow box button, the Apple API essentially only allows us to draw these square boxes on here with no border. You can still configure text color, fill color, things like that. As far as drawing basic buttons, you're generally going to be using these for overlays, for backgrounds, things like that, and use any of the bitmap buttons that are within Integration Designer. But you have the ability to draw your own buttons any size that you would like to draw them. Go ahead and delete that. There's also some buttons down here specific to the iOS devices. And as I mentioned, there's a variety of two-way graphics built into Integration Designer, sliders, bar graphs, things like that. However, most of those will not work with the RTI panel. It's a limitation of the API for the device. However, we have the ability to create those by drawing them from scratch right onto our device. So in the bottom toolbar of Integration Designer, when you have an RTI panel selected, you'll see a variety of new tools that have been selected here. First one is called a slider object. So when I go ahead and click on the slider object, make sure I'm on my Draw Button tool, now I can go onto the screen of the RTI panel and I can draw my own slider right on the screen. And as you'll see, I can make it any size that I would like to. So I can change it. I can draw it in various orientations. I can draw it vertical, horizontal, and I can make it any length that I would want. This can have a command and a variable placed on it, so again, it'll track along with my finger and it'll control my subwoofer level or my lighting load or whatever I'm putting on the screen. Another tool down here is called a gauge object. Now a gauge object allows me to draw a simple, non-controllable bar graph onto the device. We can't put a command on this, so we would use a bar graph simply for feedback, showing maybe bass and treble levels, showing volume, showing subwoofer level, lighting load, whatever it happens to be. But unlike the slider object, we can't put a command on here. So we can draw them on, and draw them in any size and any orientation that we would like to. Toggle button, two-way switch. This allows us to draw a switch object onto the screen of our devices. We can place a command on it, we can place a variable to make these into true two-way switches. So these are some of the things that are unique within Integration Designer for programming the iOS devices. Slider objects, gauge objects, and slider switch objects. So keep that in mind. Don't try and use the ones built into the software. They're not going to work out very well for you. Let's go to another screen here, and I'm going to go ahead and delete these. Now, one of the things that makes the iOS devices really pretty neat is the fact that you can create scrolling lists on here. One-way scrolling lists, two-way scrolling lists, and instead of requiring a button press to scroll through them, you have the ability to swipe. Use the native gesturing within the Apple devices to bounce, to flick, to flip through them, find and touch what you're looking to do. So again, these are features that aren't supported on native RTI remote control. So I want to demonstrate real quickly how they're done. We're going to talk about static lists or one-way lists. We'll also talk about two-way lists. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go down, again, click on our Draw Button tool, and you're going to see two tools down here. One with the number 1 on it, that's the static list object. That's a one-way list or a two-way list, which can have dynamically changing feedback based on it. So we're going to start off with our one-way or our static scrolling list. So I'm going to depress that, and now I can simply go onto my screen and draw that list any size that I'd like to make it. We can also configure some basic information about it. So I can go in and say, you know what, I don't want this list to be black. I'm going to make this a white list, and I'm going to change my text color. I'm going to go in, make my text color black. If I right-click on that scrolling list object, I can go to Edit Properties. Now within Edit Properties, you have a text option here. Text allows me to go in, choose a font, choose a typeface size, bold, italic, underline that text, all the same information, and you can see what that text is going to look like in the scrolling list sample text that's on the object itself. So configuring the color, text size, font, and adjustments to that font, all configurable directly from it. Now the next step is to go through and configure the scrolling list itself. I'm going to right-click on it and pull down to Edit Scrolling List this time. Once we've opened this up, I'm going to click on the Edit List Properties button. And this is going to ask me, okay, how many items are going to be in this particular list? And let's say that we're using this one to configure zones for a multi-zone system. So I'm going to say, you know what, I've got 8 zones in here. So first will be number 1, second will be number 8. And you'll notice that the nomenclature refers to disks. This uses the standard scrolling list wizard that was used in the Integration Designer from the get-go. Okay, so 1 through 8. Click OK, and now it shows me the 8. We can go in and label each of these. And I'm going to label them again by zones. So we'll call this the kitchen, call this one the living room. How about a theater? Powder room. Master bedroom. office, and garage. Okay, so whatever our 8 zones are. The label, what we type in there, is what's going to show up on the list. So now I'll be able to cycle through all these zones that I've placed on there. We can build our macros on here, so they could be calling that zone or flipping to that specific room or to a page or whatever you want to do. But this is really all that needs to be set up. We're going to put in our labels, and we'll go ahead and build our macros. And these are just like standard system macros where I can click on them and create anything that I want to do. I can go into my IR commands, simply drag those commands in there, creating those macros. Once that's been downloaded, I'll give you an example of what that's going to look like when we download it onto our device. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here real quickly. And here's an example of what that scrolling list that we just built would look like on our device. And again, I have 8 items on there, but we'd be able to flick. You can see that it has a line through there. I'll show you how that was created. But customizable color, text, and simply by touching this, it's going to execute the macro that's on there. It'll light up blue to show some feedback that it's actually been pressed. And that's an example of the static one-way scrolling list. Okay, let me get back to Integration Designer here. And I'll show you how we add those lines between the items. Once I finish this, I'm going to go ahead and save it, close that editor, and again, right-click on the scrolling list device itself and go to Edit Properties. Now, under Edit Properties, you can go into the General tab, and under Button Options, you'll see the option to make it inactive. Not sure why you'd want to build a scrolling list that's inactive since it doesn't do anything when it's pressed, but you also have the option here, draw lines between list items. So that's an unnecessary step. You don't have to do it, but if you want to add some delineation between those items, put this in and it's simply going to draw that line between there. Okay, so here's an example of a very basic one-way or static scrolling list. Now there's some other things you can do with the scrolling list that are even more interesting. So let's reopen this again. Right-click, Edit Scrolling List. And you'll notice there's a couple of columns in here. One of those columns, Bitmap. The Bitmap column allows me to put a graphic into my scrolling list. So I'm going to go to the Oasis library. I've got some simple icons here. I can simply grab them. And to add them to our scrolling list, here's a home office one. I'm going to click on it, drag and drop it into the Bitmap column by the appropriate zone. So now I've added that graphic in there. This one will be for my kitchen, the living room. So you can go through and add these graphics in here. Here's the bedroom, bathroom. But simply going through and dragging these graphics in here, and again, I'm being somewhat indiscriminate as I drag them over, but by placing those graphics into the bitmap column, this allows you to give a completely different appearance to what you're displaying on here. So let's go back to PowerPoint and I'll show you an example. Unfortunately, there's no emulator that I can use to show you live on the screen, so I've created these screenshots. Let's go in. And here's an example on your screen, at least it will be shortly, of an RTI panel using a static list, a one-way scrolling list where I've added those graphics. So in this case, you can see that I've changed the color. It's black with a light gray text background. And now I've placed those icons, those graphics on there, and those will scroll along with it. So the ability to add graphics to it gives you the ability to further customize the appearance for your customer. All right, back to Integration Designer. One more iteration that I want to show you on the static or one-way scrolling list would be done exactly like that. So let's say that we want to have a variable on here. This would be commonly used maybe with lighting loads or zone control. I want to see if that zone is on or off. You're going to see a variable column in here. By simply dragging a Boolean variable in here, it's going to allow us to generate a toggle button on our screen. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go to one of my two-way drivers that are in here. In this case, I've got a Lutron driver. So I'm going to go to Toggle Button Data Source and find what I want to show here. So I'm doing lighting. Here's my 8 zones. Zone 1 status. I'm going to click on it and drag it to the Zone 1. You can see it generates that little variable image there. It looks like a little gear. Zone 2 status. I'll just drag all 8 of these here. Okay, so now we've got a a fairly sophisticated list here. We've got our label, but we've also got a graphic and a variable that's going to show up on that list. Let's go back to PowerPoint and I'll show you what that would look like when we download. When we drag that variable on there, you can see that it generates an iOS toggle button on each of those. So we can scroll through there and turn on zones of lighting, for example, or turn on audio in these specific rooms, getting full two-way feedback from the device that's on there. So if the macro that I press turns on that lighting zone, the variable that I drag on there is lighting status, it's going to flip to on or off or whatever it's doing. So we can do a lot of stuff even with these basic one-way lists. And again, they support the full Apple gesturing, so I can flick them up, I can flick them down, they bounce off the top, they bounce off the bottom, I can drag them slowly or quickly. So they're a very nice way for a customer to control lists of multiple items, whether they're favorite channels, zones of lighting, sources, whatever you're putting on there. Is there a way to add channel icons to a list? Absolutely. You could drag those onto the bitmap column. You could do your channel icons on there for your favorite TV channels, for example. Would work out great. Trying to keep track of the questions coming through here. They're getting a little bit out of order. Bear with me. And we'll try and keep on. Okay, so 3 different examples of the static one-way lists. Text only, text with graphics, and a variable. So you can be very creative, and again, you have complete authority to make these things look and act exactly the way that you want them to. All right, now let's talk a little bit about two-way scrolling lists. Now the two-way scrolling list, back to Integration Designer here, is a little bit different in that the two-way scrolling list is populated by a driver with the feedback, with the information that's on there. Now most, if not all of you, are going to be familiar with a typical RTI two-way scrolling list, where it's going to display, artists, albums, playlists, whatever there is from my device, prompted by the driver. And then we have object commands that allow us to scroll up and down through the list. I can touch it or I can select items from that. Now it's done a little bit differently on the iOS device because we don't have hard buttons to control it. And since we have the ability to do gesturing, we don't need to have those commands on there. So it becomes very simple to create these two-way scrolling lists on here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. And I'm going to go back to my iPod page that I loaded in here. Now in this case, I'm going to go ahead and delete this object because it's already on there from the page wizard. But let's say that I have an RTI dock, an iPod dock in my system, and I want to create a list so I can browse through the content that's on here. I'm going to go through and I'm going to draw that list right on my screen. So I'm going to hit my Draw button tool. This time, I'm going to choose the two-way scrolling list object. So I click Draw button, and then the two-way scrolling list object. Now I can go on here, and again, simply draw it on the screen, making it any size that I would like to make it. So you can see, again, this one's the native black text on a white background, but of course we can change that. I can go in and I can make it transparent, for example, and I want the text to be white. So I can fill all that information out, I can size it, make it any way that I want. Now that we've drawn the list on there, we're simply going to assign the commands and variables to it just as we would with any two-way list integration designer. So we're going to go up and I'm going to find a driver. So I'm using the RTI dock, which is now shipping and available. And the first thing we're going to do is go to our driver commands. When I click on this, I want to be able to select an item from the list. So I'm going to find the browsing, select from browse list. Click, drag, and drop it on there. And that's all you need to do. We need to put the variable on there, but as far as selecting items, we simply flick till we find what we want, and we touch it right on our screen. There's our command. I've also got to back up the browse list here so I can back out to artists, albums, playlists, whatever I put on there. Now we need to put the variable on here. Item list data source, browsing list. Drag and drop it right on there. And again, I can customize the appearance of this, the text, all that stuff by just right-clicking on it, going to Edit Properties, and again, we can choose to draw those lines between our list items or not. Font, typeface size, bold, italic, underline, all that stuff is created on there as well. And we can also choose whether it uses the highlight when we select an item or not. Click OK, and now it's configured. Let's go back to our PowerPoint, and let's see what it would actually look like. Okay, so there's an example of a two-way scrolling list. So these are some features that I demonstrated that are a bit different than programming a standard RTI device in there, but they really allow us to exploit some of the very neat features of these iOS devices. So again, keep in mind scrolling lists are a great way to add functionality, ease of use, and simply aesthetically pleasing features to the control system as well. All right, question in the chat window, what does the variables tab do? That's where I drag that variable to get that toggling switch that we had on our screen. As you can see here, by dragging a variable from a driver in here, it's automatically going to generate that toggle button in there. And if the macro turns on and off that lighting, for example, that switch will report exactly what happens in there. Okay, at this point we're going to continue on with the PowerPoint. So you've got a feel for how to install the license onto the device and some of the unique programming features within the RTI panel. Uploading the file. Once you create the system file and you upload it, you hit the send to devices, you're going to see that there's only a processor that's in there. In fact, I'll show you really quickly in Integration Designer, since I have it open here still. If I were to send the system file in there, by hitting send to devices, notice that all that shows up is the processor. There's no iPhone for me to download into. And that's again because the interface, not only the system file, not only the program, but the graphics for that iPhone are actually downloaded into the processor. The processor then pushes those graphics onto the iOS device where they become resident. So it stores them and loads them on there. And that's why we require that additional memory to use these. So if I hit send and upload this information in there, you see it goes fairly quickly, loads it in, now it's up to date. How do we download this information into the Apple device? Back to PowerPoint here. Uploading the file. Okay. Now, once we've uploaded to our processor, now our system file is on the processor. Now the graphic interface for our iOS device is in our central control processor. I'm going to go into settings. I'm going to confirm that the Wi-Fi is on my iPhone or my iPad. I'm going to confirm that it's on the same network as my RTI central control processor. Once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and hit the RTI panel icon, and it's going to open up the Welcome to RTI panel button. We talked about demo mode a little bit earlier. This time, though, we're going to hit the Get Started button. Once I click on Get Started, it's going to search and see if it can locate that RTI processor on the network. It's going to auto-discover it. So here you can see a screenshot where it's discovered my XP3 on the network. It says, okay, I found a compatible processor. Here's the IP address. Here's the name. Is this the correct processor? We're going to choose, we're going to choose the appropriate gateway processor, the one that we set up in there, and we're going to go ahead and click on the name of the processor under Local Network. Once it finds it, it's going to say, okay, you've chosen the processor. Here's the sample files that are on here, or the system files that are on here. So maybe there's, iPhone mom, iPhone dad, whatever it is, whatever's compatible with the device that you're currently working with. We're going to choose the system file that we want to be downloaded into that phone. So in this case, I have one on here that says iPhone 1. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And now we're telling the processor, okay, start pushing that graphic and system file information into the iOS device. It's going to show me a downloading configuration page. It's going to show me a graph on there. Depending on the size of the file, it takes somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds to download that entire file to the device. Over Wi-Fi, it'll even do it over 3G, but boom. And this only happens the very first time that we set up the system file. Once it's on there, that file again becomes resident on the Apple device, so we don't need to do this each and every time that it happens. Once the configuration is downloaded, it'll automatically run the application, and then we'll have all of our custom graphics and our control system right on our screen. But again, this downloading step is only necessary upon the initial download. Any changes to the file will automatically download. This is a great feature. So if you've given yourself maybe a private VPN into your customer's processor so you can update their programming, if I updated my customer's programming, next time he picks up his iPad or his iPhone, opens it up, it's going to say, oh, hold on a second, I found a new configuration. It's going to show me this downloading configuration screen, zip, it's going to zip through it, and it's going to load that new file on there automatically. Customer owes you money, tunnel into their processor, put a screen on their iPhone that says, if you want this to work, send me a check. So it allows you to easily update the programming from the device, and again, because it resides on the central control processor. Now, somebody asked earlier, what if my customer has 2 homes? Or what if they have a system in their home and a system in their office, for example? Can I use the same iOS device to control both of those? Absolutely. What we can do is we can tell the RTiPanel application to force configuration. So what we can do is go into settings. If we go into the settings of the Apple device, we're going to scroll down and find the RTiPanel. Go ahead and click on that, and it's going to take you to a screen called Reconfigure. I'm going to turn Reconfigure to on. If I toggle that over to on, close this, and then reopen the RTI panel, it's going to go back to that Get Started page. Choose the new processor for the new house. Choose a thing and download it. So we can absolutely force it to reconfigure so it can communicate with multiple systems. You just need to teach your customer how to do it through settings, which they should be familiar with doing anyway through the applications. And that's the configuration process. Go to question in the chat window here. When are you going to have scrolling text for long music or text titles? We already do. I'll show you how to do it. Back off. A little bit off topic, but this will work on the RTI panel as well. So let's go to Integration Designer. And I'm just going to add a simple device here. Let's throw in a T2C+. Okay. So I got a T2C+ here. And he's talking about scrolling text. What if I have a song name that's longer than the screen that I'm putting it into? So I'm going to go ahead and draw a button on there. Let's add some text to it. Can't spell. Much exclamation point. Okay. So I put text on there. Probably should make it a color that you can read. I put a bunch of text on there. Now in this case, let's say that our button is smaller or our font is larger. It won't all fit in there. We can go to Edit Text and let's kick that up to 14-point type. That's obviously not going to fit on that entire button. Sometimes these buttons are going to be even smaller. It says thanks for attending. How do I get all that information on the screen? So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on this and go to Edit Properties. Under Edit Properties, you'll see there's a Text tab. Go ahead and click on Text. It shows me my font, my typeface size, my alignment, but you're also going to see an option there for text wrapping. Text wrapping is how this information is displayed on the button. Normal is what you see here. It displays what fits on the button and it doesn't display the rest. That's the normal default state of it. However, if I click on this, I can choose a single line. A single line with ellipses. A single line with ellipses means it'll show ... at the end. Hey, there's more information that fits here. Or a number of different scrolling options. Scroll slow, scroll fast, scroll side to side. So I'll just choose scroll fast nonstop. Click OK. And now I've told this text, if it exceeds the parameter of that box, it's going to scroll. If it fits in the box, stays put. But if it's longer, it's going to go ahead and scroll. I'll open it up in the emulator here. I'll have to display it on the screen for you. Bear with me just a moment. Unfortunately, it looks a little flaky over the 3 frames per minute that the web conferencing software does, but it scrolls smoothly across the screen. So you can use that on lists, you can use it on buttons, and that feature is available right now. Okay. Whoops, showing the wrong thing. Bear with me. Back to Integration Designer. Okay. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I'll stay online and answer some questions for you, but since we're recording this, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you for attending. Very much appreciate your time today. My name is Clint Forberg, Director of Training for RTI, and have a great night.